illustrate the thoughts. But I definitely haven't written anything down because that would be organized, and I'm entirely too chaotic for that. So for context, last week, I think it was, or maybe it was the week before, I think it was last week though, the card of the week that I had on my Instagram was the Queen of Cups. And now I've pulled the card for next week, and it's the King of Cups. And really, like, this whole card of the week thing that I'm doing is really interesting because I'm like sitting with a card for a whole week instead of just a single day, which I've never really done before, like sat with a single card for that long, really deliberately. And so having just sat with the Queen of Cups and now with the King of Cups, and sort of comparing the ways that people think about those two cards, I'm having a lot of thoughts about gender in tarot. And these are not new thoughts, right? I think these are thoughts that a lot of people have had before, conversations that a lot of people have had before. But it's the internet, and we're all a little bit narcissistic, so now I have to give my thoughts on the way gender is in tarot, right? So for context, I started out with this deck here. This is the classic Rider-Waite, specifically this is the Centennial edition, the travel size. It comes in the cute little metal tin. Love it as my first deck, very classic, very traditional, and still one of my favorite decks. This is my faithful, always go back to this deck. But if you have gone through the traditional Rider-Waite Tarot, you know that gender, in terms of the depictions in this card, or this deck rather, is really heavily weighted towards male figures and male protagonists. It's a little bit old-fashioned in that way. And that's something that's definitely switched up in a lot of other decks, particularly the major arcana. You'll see a lot of switching up with gender, with characters like the High Priest or the Magician, or the Hierophant, right, being kind of flipped around and gender swapped. A lot of those you don't even necessarily have to change the names, right? But one of the most interesting ways that gender shows up in tarot, I find, personally, and what I want to talk about today, is the way that gender shows up in the court cards. So I had to go through all of the three decks that I want to kind of use to talk about today, and I had to pull out the court cards. So if we look in the traditional Rider-Waite, and we just have the suit of wands here as an example, we have our classic king, we have our queen, we have the knight, and we have the page, right? That's the Rider-Waite system right there. All four suits, king, queen, knight, page. And if you look at the descriptions in terms of like the definitions of the cards, the page and the knight are not necessarily strictly gendered. This is where you find gender mixed up the most often in different decks, not in the way that the cards are named, but just in the way that they're depicted, right? A page does not necessarily have to be a male page. It could be a female page. You can absolutely have female knights. Female knights are my favorite, right? But they are what they are. So the page is a student. They're like just starting out on their journey with the suit. The knight is active. They are the goers and the doers. And then you have the kings and the queens. And the kings and the queens is where gender gets very, very interesting. Now this is the King and Queen of Wands, but like I said, I've been really sitting with the King and Queen of Cups as well, and just kind of this idea of the kings and the queens. And these are not new thoughts for me. I've had a lot of feelings about the way that gender shows up in tarot for years. So one of the decks that I acquired kind of early on in my tarot journey, I got in part specifically because of the way that gender shows up in the deck. I pretty much just dealt with really traditional Rider-Waite decks, and so I was very used to the knight and the page showing up as male. And what this deck does, this is the Wild Unknown Tarot, And great, the wands are on top here too. What this deck does is it switches up the court cards. Instead of the king, you now have the father of wands. You have the mother of wands. But then instead of the knight and the page, what you have is the son and the daughter. And so suddenly more female representation, right? That's kind of how I saw this concept initially, and it's just having some really conscious, really deliberate female representation in the deck. And I liked the idea of that, of having more women in the deck, right? Girl power, feminism. At this point in my life, I was kind of fresh out of a very deeply patriarchal, high control religion, where like all of the power was masculine and women were very much like the only thing you could do is stay home and have babies, and that was it, right? And so I love this idea of like, yeah, more female representation in the deck. But the longer I've sat with this deck, the less I like it. The less I like it. And going through the guidebook, the less I like it. And I don't know if it's because of this specifically or what it is. I actually don't use this deck very much. I have it. I really love the idea of it. I love the idea of the artwork, but this is not a deck I use very much. And I don't know how much the court cards have to do with that, because I do not like replacing the page and the knight with a son and a daughter. Because in tarot, the court cards represent a journey to mastery, right? If we're looking at this knight, page, king, queen sort of dynamic, what you have is the page first starting out, very young, very inexperienced. That's very much how the page is read, right? A student learning about passion, creativity, what the wands represent at their core, right? And then after you're a student, you kind of graduate to become the knight. You're not just learning anymore. You're going out and you're doing things with the things that you've learned. You are going out and putting what you've learned into practice. The knight is no longer just learning. The knight is proactive and active. And then you have mastery, which shows up as the king and queen. And that's where, again, gender gets problematic, because the queen is feminine, so of course she's receptive. The king is masculine, so of course he's assertive. And you have these very, very gender binary ideas of what that means. Receptive versus active, right? Where the feminine, in a terrible way, is always portrayed almost kind of weaker, right? It becomes this hierarchy where the queen is always after the king in the suit. That's the stack, right? And that's not to reduce in any way those traditionally quote-unquote feminine traits, but gender's more complicated than that, right? I have a friend who is very, very much feminine, and the card that represents her most often in a deck is the King of Wands. That's how she shows up, because this is her energy. Passionate, creative, dominant energy, right? Leadership energy. And so when you replace this with the son and the daughter, what you get, I find, and was sitting with the guidebook, this is just a personal opinion, like if you feel differently about this deck, that's totally fine, but the way I feel about it is that you're building the same kind of hierarchy where the son is above the daughter. Because if you read the guidebook, the daughter is still being described in the way that the page is described, as a student, as a learner. And the son is described as being more active, because that's what the knights represent traditionally, right? You still have to have that balance of learning versus doing, and I don't like gendering it. So what do I like? It's a much better question, right? This is one of my favorite decks right here, or at least a sampling of it. These are just the court cards. But this is the Weaver Tarot from Threads of Fate. Now, I got these because I love the holographic. The rainbow holographic. It's so shiny, right? But one of the interesting things about this deck, not just the court cards, but this deck as a whole, is it is very deliberately genderless. This deck, they went through everything. They're not just switching up the major arcana to fit a certain theme. The changes they've made to the major arcana are deliberately in order to strip away any sort of gendering concepts. Any of those words that would make people think immediately, just intuitively, of a masculine or a feminine, they've changed. So you've got things like, instead of the high priestess, priestess is very female, you have the high sage, right? You no longer have the magician, you have the magi. So really interesting ways that they've changed those up. But the court cards is where gender gets very interesting in this deck. So what we have on top here is the cups, so I'm just going to use that. The first card you have is the seeker. This is what replaces the page, and that makes sense, right? If pages in tarot are students and messengers, it makes sense that you would call them a seeker, right? This is a seeker of knowledge. They're pursuing whatever represents the suit, in this case, emotions, right? And then you have the conqueror. Now, it's interesting making the knights a conqueror specifically. It makes them a little bit more aggressive instead of just active, right? So you move from learning, seeking, to kind of this dominating energy, conquering energy, right? But then they've changed the king and the queen, so what you now have is the sovereign and the ruler. Now, the artwork, I personally feel, is still a little bit gendered. If you kind of go through the whole deck, I do find that the rulers, which are the kings, the crowns are a little bit more what you would think of as traditionally masculine. And the sovereigns, who are replacing the queens, the crowns, look a little bit more feminine. But it's definitely more neutral than the traditional Rider-Waite, right? Sovereign versus ruler. Now, the guidebook, I probably should have reread the guidebook, honestly, to remember how the guidebook defines these two cards, right? Sovereign versus ruler. Because I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's very much kind of in the way that the Rider-Waite does, where the sovereigns are receptive and the rulers are really active. But I work a lot with the concept of sovereignty in my spirituality. This is kind of like a key pivotal point of my spiritual path, because coming out of, like I said, a very, very controlling, high demand religion, reclaiming my personal sovereignty has been really important to me. I work almost exclusively with the Morrigan in terms of deities, and primarily in her role as a goddess of sovereignty. So when I think of the idea of sovereignty, that is something very interesting and very impactful. And there is a way that I conceptualize the cards in this deck, and a way that I really love using this deck in terms of the court cards specifically, to think about this path of growth that you now have in the court cards. The seeker, you learn. The conqueror, you do. You go out and you do the things, right? But then you learn sovereignty. And when I think of sovereignty, I think about being self-contained. I think about mastery over self, right? Sovereignty, in a lot of ways, like when you make sovereignty a key part of your spiritual practice, in practicality, that looks a lot like boundary work and having good boundaries and going to therapy and working on having good boundaries. So if the sovereign is about boundaries and mastery of self, the ruler can then become the next stage of that, which is where you become a leader of others. And this is my favorite way to think about the court cards if we're going to make it a progression, right? You seek, you do, You find mastery over yourself, and that is a key thing that you need before you can actually rule, right? This is beyond sovereignty of the self. This is leading others. This is where you go out and you put that into practice in connection with other people. So the Sovereign of Cups is deeply intuitive and very emotional, and yes, receptive to the emotions of others without sacrificing herself. But the ruler now becomes a leader, someone who helps other people learn those skills, someone who brings that sovereignty into connection with others and into community. And that, so far, to date at least, in my tarot journey, that is my favorite way to think about and conceptualize the core cards. If we're going to take gender out of it, which arguably I think there's a lot of value in that because we don't all show up with this binary gender, right? That's not something that suits a lot of people. That's something that serves a lot of people. I really love this idea of sovereignty and rulership that you get with this particular deck. Definitely my favorite deck so far, simply in terms of how gender shows up in this deck. That peeling back of the traditional gender binary and just letting people be people and embracing core concepts instead of the ideas of gender. But it's just the favorite that I found so far, right? There could be other decks that have other ways of expressing gender that I have not discovered yet. So, if there's a deck that you know and love that has a really interesting way of dealing with gender and sort of representing gender in the cards, and it could be the core cards or it could just be the major arcana, but if there's a deck that's really interesting to you in terms of how gender shows up, I would personally love to hear about it because I'm very, very curious. A lot of my decks follow the very, very traditional Rider-Waite system, particularly when it comes to the core cards and kind of the way that gender is dealt with. So I'm very interested in decks that twist that a little bit and change that a little bit. Just some thoughts for you today. Definitely let me know yours in the comments, and I will talk to you later. Bye.